Welcome to Biblically Speaking. My name is Cassie Bellino, and I'm your host. In this podcast, we talk about the Bible in simple terms with experts, PhDs, and scholarly theologians to make understanding God easier. These conversations have transformed my relationship with Christ and understanding of religion. Now, I'm sharing these recorded conversations with you. On this podcast, we talk about the facts, the history, and the translations to make the Bible make sense, so we can get to know God, our Creator, better. Cool. Now we're recording. Justin, I'm so glad to have you back. How have you been?
Been great. Thank you so much for having me again.
Yeah, I've been wanting to talk about prophets for a really long time, mostly because I didn't understand them, to be honest. I always just imagined, this is so embarrassing, but I always imagined like the Oracle from 300. And when I started hearing about prophecies
right
in the Bible, I just was so confused how it works and how it wasn't magic. But, today we're talking about Elijah. Everybody who isn't watching, Justin Gerhardt from Holy Ghost Stories is back. And if you don't remember him, he was leading our Jonah episode, which I got raving reviews on. Everyone loved the clips. They loved it. They loved the music. Yeah, that was such a fun episode. So I had to find a way to get you back on the show. And this Elijah episode, this was probably one of the first episodes I listened to when you first DM'd me, and I was like, oh, I'll listen to some stuff. Truly, like listening to the episode, the moment where the widow has to trust her last bit of food with a stranger, and she decides to, just spoke to me in volumes. And we'll get into this and we'll listen to the clips, but it was one of those moments where you like listen to something Christian and then it happens in your life, and you're like, God just wants me to trust him with like the little bit of flour that I have left in order to like repay me in full, like in a way that I didn't even fathom, in a magic kind of way, like what happens in this story is magic and impossible, and yet it happens. So I'm so excited about this story. What do you think about the story? Why did you focus on? Yeah.
This story is amazing. It's always like, it's been one of those that I can remember for a long time, like really being captivated by this story. That jar of flour and the jar of oil and the bread, and then the ravens, which we'll get to, the little boy's death. Like there's a lot of like hooks in terms of this story grabbing your attention, and a lot of mystery. And you're not wrong in a certain way. I think magic, the way, we might talk about magic in some ways today. And then you've got this, it's like all layered on top of this backdrop of the confusing mystery of the biblical prophets, which is a whole thing by itself. So I love this story.
Yeah, I haven't read much about the other prophets, but as far as the research that I've done so far, Elijah was a bit of a wild man. Do you think that's just because he lived in the wilderness for a bit, or do you think that's like who he was inherently?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. He is mysterious, and like I think the wild man thing, like I don't know if this prompted your thinking of him that way, but when John the Baptist comes along, who lives out in the wilderness and eats wild locusts and honey, or locusts and wild honey. I don't think a lot of people were farming locusts at the time. Regular locusts and wild honey. Anyway, he's kind of like created sort of in the mold of Elijah, right? In some ways, he's Elijah revisited, and so
I like that.
John the Baptist was this mountain man living out by the Jordan, and so is that who Elijah is? He's definitely a character, and becomes more and more a character, as most of us do over the course of our lives. We get him in this story pretty early in his life. In fact, this is some of the first stuff that we find out about Elijah, and it's not the stuff that we usually get or often get, at least at the beginning of a prophet's call by Yahweh. Elijah is one of a few prophets who we just have no idea anything about his calling. We don't know where he was. We don't know how he was called, like what the first time he heard from Yahweh was. all of that is sort of shrouded in mystery. We don't know with Elijah. Yeah.
Gosh, that keeps happening. This happened with Job. Just
Right.
don't know. And I think that maybe is signaling to us that we're not supposed to know. It's not really about Elijah. It's not really about Job and like how old was he and what was his occupation. As much as we want to relate to the character, to me that kind of flags like God's like, look at me, don't look at him.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. But yeah, like you mentioned the prophets and sort of being new to the idea of a biblical prophet, and you're completely right. Most of us are bringing like the connotation of that word that comes from a world in which that is a word that we hear in the world. And usually it's in the context of like a fortune teller or like a seer, like, you know, this guy in 300 that you mentioned, or Nostradamus, or like someone like that, right? They tell the future. They like have like glazed over eyes and, you know, like they smoke something weird and then you get a, you know, vision from them and you know the future. Or they tell you when the world's going to end. That is not the biblical role of a prophet, right? So when you, like in the Bible, prophets, first of all, you have to paint with a bit of a broad brush because they're pretty varied. But the one like through line with prophets in the Bible is they are essentially advocates for the covenant, or like lawyers or attorneys for Yahweh's covenant with his people.
Whoa.
So when the covenant is breached, it's the prophets who are sent by Yahweh to go and sort of take Israel to court, essentially.
Really?
And levy charges against them and outline the ways in which they have been unfaithful to the covenant and the punishments that will be meted out because of that failure to obey.
Oh, that paints such a clear picture, Justin.
So yeah, like when you read like Hosea, for instance, it's a super confusing book. Hosea is the one, I don't know if you've read it before, like Hosea is the one he's told, he's a prophet, he's called by Yahweh, and he's told to go marry a promiscuous woman.
Yeah.
And her name is Gomer, the woman he ends up marrying. They're married. Gomer cheats on him repeatedly, and Hosea is told to go and take her back. And the whole thing is like an object lesson that demonstrates Yahweh's faithfulness in response to Israel's unfaithfulness to the terms of the covenant, right? Which is, you know, like we're familiar with the idea of allegory, but being called by God to live a life, like this is Hosea's real life. It's not just an object lesson, like it's not a theoretical scenario, you know? So it's a tough gig to be Hosea. But anyway, and then like that's like the first 3 chapters, and then you just get this litany, the rest of the book, chapter after chapter of just, it can be confusing. Like, what am I reading? It feels like we're like kind of circling around and swirling in an eddy current, kind of covering the same ground again and again. What is this? And what it is basically is a series of indictments by God through his prophet Hosea, saying Israel didn't keep the covenant. Here's how angry I am about that. Here's the punishment they're going to have to endure because of it. And interestingly, this is like throughout the prophets, you get this this clear picture that Yahweh can't help but envision a future where Israel comes back to him and he forgives them, and it's all better again. And sometimes that hope for the future seems just straight up naive. It's a very like a very personal sort of picture of the God of the universe and all of his swirling emotions that are provoked by a people who will not be faithful to him. So anyway, that's going to happen in various ways throughout all the prophets. A lot of times when they deliver like a message, it is as if they are taking Israel to court, levying charges against them for failure to keep the terms of the covenant. And so that is the role of the prophet. overall, they're going to look to the future. Sometimes they will say things that will happen in the future and thereby like, quote, tell the future. But so often they're talking about now, right? They're just messengers, and God is always looking through and around at and inside of time. And so, of course, some of the stuff is going to deal with the future. Some of the stuff they say is going to deal with the past. A lot of it's going to deal with the present. But that's just because they are essentially the mouthpiece of Yahweh. And so whatever he has to say, he's going to say it through them. And he has just different things to say, and he's going to say it in different ways. And that's why you get such a variety of like material when you read the prophets, or books that contain the work of prophets like Elijah. So like Jonah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, like they get books of the Bible, right, that are essentially collections of their prophecies. Elijah, super major prophet, the history of Israel, but Elijah doesn't get his own book. We get descriptions of what he does in books like First Kings here.
Got it. That is really interesting. And I think even as we get deeper into the story, it's not necessarily a linear story. Like tragedy continues to hit before, we're going to set the scene in a second as to like why this is even happening. But even throughout Elijah's story, like bad things keep happening. And then, I mean, we don't even cover it in this story as a whole, but kind of like the pinnacle of what Elijah accomplishes. It is interesting how you talk about how it does swirl around and like the allegory that God wants to teach us. It's not so much a linear, here's an issue, and then a prophet came to save them or deliver the message, and then all is well. It's very different and layered and complicated, as our God should be. I don't want a simple God.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's like, it's not, yeah. And I think a lot of times the narrative is not circling, like meandering or like directionless. A lot of times it's like spiraling, like intentionally wrapping around and getting tighter and tighter and tighter to make a very specific, very powerful point. But anyway, okay, so Elijah. We don't know who he is. We don't know where he's from, but here he is.
Yeah, you just wiped out all my intro questions, but I am
sorry.
curious.
Yeah.
Do you think there's any modern day prophets? Like, is there somebody, or just in the last 100 years, or do you think this is more of an ancient Israelite thing?
For me, a few different people would maybe give you a few different answers, like nuanced differences. Yeah. But for me, if we think of prophecy in terms of like its general meaning, then I would say yes, there are prophets today and can have been throughout history and continue to be. In fact, prophecy is one of the spiritual gifts, like one of the gifts of the Spirit listed in the New Testament, like Romans 12 and 1 Corinthians 12, right alongside other gifts. And if we think of okay, what does that mean? I think what it means in terms of how the Spirit is gifting prophets today, it has more to do with that sort of general, this person is functioning as a mouthpiece of God, right? Mm-hmm. Not necessarily that this person is called into service, that they're going to write their own book of the Bible. I think those roles were unique for these people, men and women who have served in those roles in the past that we have reference to in the Bible. But I do think that God does still call people and speak powerfully through them in a way that's a little different than an average evangelist or preacher or teacher. A lot of times what's prophetic, I think, is pokey. That's often a hallmark that is probably true of the way God uses prophets now, just as he always has. Usually the message of a prophet is provocative, right? It's got some edges to it. It is going to ruffle feathers. It is going to irk some folks. Again, because who are they? What do they do? They are God's attorneys, right? Yeah. Bringing suits against his unfaithful people. And so a lot of times the message that they have to deliver is uncomfortable to hear.
Yeah. That's interesting. I feel like we just had a guest on one of my lives, Melissa Smith. Her Instagram is God's Little Hummingbird, and she is she definitely put some thorns in my side in a good way, as far as like, hey, I think, God is speaking to me that this is what a Christian life looks like. And we did a recorded live. It's on the Instagram, but she said a lot of things that like my church wasn't telling me. And she's like, this is what God has told me. And this is how he's telling me you should live. You shouldn't go to church. You should Sabbath on Saturday, like as it's called. Like she had so many things to say, and she had all the verses to back it up. She was so knowledgeable. And whether you agree with her or not, she was so clearly moved by God and like operating on his behalf and speaking on his behalf, even if it wasn't the conventional Christianity that like we want to hear and be encouraged by. I mean, my next question is like, how do you know if you're a prophet? Like, do you like, how do you know that you woke up and now God's speaking to you? But I'm sure that if God's voice was in your life, it'd be pretty evident, and you would just be like, I don't know what I'm doing.
It's the beginning of an answer. Yes. I think it's also true that over time we learn to listen, right? And that is like a muscle that has to be exercised and has to grow. So I think God can speak and we can be sort of deaf to it. I also know that Yahweh is able to shout so that even deaf people can hear. And we have examples of that, I think, with some of the prophets even, like Jonah, was not like, I think I want to like really work on my ability to listen to God, because I just want to hear anything that he wants to say. I just want to hear you, Yahweh. Like, that's not what Jonah's doing. Right. And yet Yahweh has no trouble communicating with him. And so that's part of the mystery of our God. Like he's so often not going to do the same thing the same way twice, even communicating through people,
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for that explanation. Let's get into the story. And if you don't mind kind of setting the scene for like your story is awesome because it starts with that moment of contempt where essentially Elijah just said to Ahab, who, I mean, I would love some background here on Ahab, good guy, bad guy, his wife, Jezebel, do we love her? Do we hate her? But he essentially is like, hey, it's not going to rain until you bend the knee. I mean, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, well, no, it's basically Israel's in a bad spot. One of the like most famously bad kings is on the throne. His name is Ahab. His wife's name is Jezebel. Even non-Bible people will have heard of one or both of those. And the reason Ahab is like bad, quote unquote, sometimes we get a little reductive with our categorizing people into is he good or bad? Is she good or bad? And even Ahab, by the way, Jezebel seems to just kind of be bad. She doesn't really have a redeeming moment in the stories that we get about her in Scripture. Ahab does have a moment. It's outside the scope of what we'll talk about today, but like anybody, he's a human being. Jezebel's a human being, but they are humans who have made very poor choices with regard to like, are we going to care about what Yahweh says and what he wants? Specifically, for whatever reason, Ahab marries Jezebel, who happens to be like a very well-connected person. She is well-connected and she's very powerful. She is the high priestess of the Asherah cult in that region. Asherah was one of the gods, usually represented by like a tall wooden pole, and these poles would be set up. You'll hear the Asherah poles talked about in Scripture sometimes. In the Old Testament, these poles would be set up in centers of worship or high places, would serve as idols essentially. Well, that was like Jezebel's jam. Like she was the person, and Ahab marries her. Whether or not Ahab was super loyal to Yahweh before he marries this woman, he definitely is not after. And she's involved in not just Asherah worship, but Baal, who was like the god of storms, very like OG sort of high up Canaanite god figure, represented by a bull usually. And so Israel, it's not just Ahab's fault. They've been worshiping Baal for years now. And so they're just in a bad spot. They've made bad choices. They've been led down, terrible roads. And the most recent and deserving of their own spot on the highlight reel. The most recent sort of failed leader or leaders are Ahab and Jezebel, and they have just continued to lead Israel down a terrible path. And so Yahweh has some things to say to this king who is leading his people wrongly, and he says them, as he so often does, through a person who is a prophet. And this is the first, so when Elijah goes to communicate to Ahab, this is some of the first stuff that we get about Elijah. Yeah. So maybe he's if this is his inaugural commission, which we don't know for sure if it is, but he's maybe 25, 30 years old. And and so he just delivers this very simple, very pointed message. He says that as Yahweh, the God of Israel, who I serve, lives, there will be neither dew nor rain in Israel for the next few years, except at my word. In other words, you have done this terrible thing. You have led Israel astray. Your punishment is going to get really dry, really quick, and it's going to happen for years. And when he says that, Ahab is really ticked off.
Yeah, because that's more so saying my God's stronger than yours. You picked the wrong God. You picked the weaker God. And I'm nobody. You have no idea who I am. And I just told you how things are going to go.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. And Ahab's who even are you? What did you say
who
your
let
name
you in?
is? Yes. But he knows enough, I think, to know that though Yahweh is not a God he wants to follow exclusively, Yahweh is also not a God to be trifled with. And he and his wife evidently start cooking up a plan. And they think somehow that the way to deal with Yahweh's plan to bring famine or drought is to deal with Yahweh's prophet. And if they can just kill Elijah, it'll all be over, which is not a good plan, but they get to work on it pretty quick.
Got it. And so because of that, God tells Elijah, go hang out in the woods, go camping, and I'll direct you via ravens, and they'll tell you when you can go. They'll tell you what to eat. And Elijah goes, yeah, checks out. Or
100%. He was like, what? That's there are two things that come out of a prophet's mouth, as a professional reality. One is all the words of Yahweh. And secondly is what? Because half of what he says is so confusing and just out of the blue. So he tells him, essentially, he tells him to go, not run, but he's on the run, essentially, because Yahweh knows that Ahab and Jezebel are plotting against his life. And so he tells him to go to this ravine where there's this little brook called Gerhardt. And he said, don't worry about what you'll eat. I've talked to the ravens and they're going to bring you food. This. Right. Yeah. As if that's normal. And I'm sure Elijah's just shaking his head what in the world have I gotten myself into? But I love, those are Yahweh's words. You will drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you with food. The ravens, He's the ravens. We talk all the time.
Mr. and Mrs. Raven? I don't think I've met them yet.
Yes, they're good people. So that's the plan. You go to the brook, drink from that, and I've talked to the ravens, and they'll bring you food.
Okay, let's jump into the first clip, which I wanted to start here. It's really hard picking clips for these, Justin. They're all so good, but this is great because this is a positive clip. This is him enjoying the ravens. And just imagine you being Elijah and having full submission. So I'll jump into it.
Birdsong precedes the dawn at Gerhardt. Pipits, wagtails, and warblers, buntings, desert finches, and the odd blue-cheeked bee-eater all offer back to Yahweh the music he gave them. Elijah stretches beneath his shelter, sloughing off sleep's cocoon, awakening to another enchanted day in the Almighty's care. He makes his way down to the brook, scoops the cool spring water into his cupped hands, and drinks, splashes his face, and blinks, looking east to the low-slung mountains, out toward where his family lives, where the sun's brazen approach makes the sky blush with anticipation. Soon, they will arrive. Elijah looks forward to this regular visitation, surely. These days in hiding are solitary, and the young prophet is not a man who loves being alone. If he cannot speak to his family or his friends back home, he can at least speak to the ravens. Is it a sprawling flock that arrives each morning? A mass of shadowy shapes swarming toward Elijah's camp, clutching crusts of stolen bread and meat in their talons, dropping their payload as they alight on the banks of the brook, cawing and jabbering to one another in boisterous communion. Or is it just 2 or 3 birds, each of them carrying a sizable trove of food, feathers fluttering against the still morning air as they circle downward toward the waiting Elijah, hopping on the grass, ebony eyes blinking as they tilt their heads? If it's just a few, perhaps it's the same few each day. One team in the morning and another at sundown. These daily visits would afford Elijah the chance to get to know these servants of Yahweh. Ravens are famously intelligent, renowned among their avian counterparts for their ability to craft and use tools, plan for the future, barter, remember people's faces, even play games like hide and seek. Perhaps Elijah discovers their startling capacity for mimicking human speech, teaching his dark-winged friends to say his name, to reply when he tells them good morning, to sing with him his songs of praise. At least these birds have not bowed their knees to Baal. Things at Kerit are quiet, but good. Elijah is safe and well-fed.
I love that. I love how you really emphasize the intelligence of the birds. And even just how ravens can mimic speech, and even maybe these are the same groups of ravens, that remember him and come back each day and know his face, and who knows, but I think it is absolutely wild that he had complete reliance for his survival on birds. And it kind of reminds me of that verse, do the birds worry about where their food's coming from? They don't stress, so you shouldn't either. I mean, I'm butchering the verse, but you know which one I'm talking about. And
yeah.
It makes it sound like a idyllic getaway in an oasis where birds are bringing you food and meat, but I'm sure the reality of it was pretty rough, having an animal drop food for you. And you're like,
I'm sure it's strange. Why can't it be both, Cassian? I think it was probably a little of both, or a lot of both. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. A very Dickensian sort of reality out there by the brook for Elijah. I think he was happy to be safe. He was happy to be taken care of. Even today, this happens less now, but there was a time, probably when our kids were little, when my wife and I would every once in a while just fantasize a little bit about going to prison.
This one does. Yep.
It was, the attraction was you just don't have to worry about anything. It's all food shows up when you need it. There's not bills to, it's just such a simple,
I see.
contained.
I think so.
We didn't have
you heard a place called?
We didn't have the money for that. We were just take us to prison and just give us 3 squares a day. But this is a version of that. It's a simple life. He's protected. He's cared for. It's quiet, and he's companioned by not only Yahweh but these birds. And I'm sure it was lonely, and that's I think part of maybe why God takes care of him this way. And I mentioned in that scene that Elijah is not a man who loves being alone. One of the reasons I say that is because of what we get in 1 Kings chapter 19, when he's all despondent in the cave, sort of, in this season of depression, because he thinks he's all alone in Israel. Like, he's the only one who hasn't bowed his knee to Baal, right? And so he doesn't like being the only. Some people are like energized by being the Lone Ranger. I don't think Elijah was one of those people. And so I think it's a kindness from God to send his food by way of these very like sentient avian creatures. And all of that stuff in that scene that I mentioned is true. It's like, ravens, that whole corvid family of birds is fascinating. Ravens cousin, the magpie, which is more of like a British bird, is one of like I don't know, like 5 animal species on Earth that have passed the mirror test, which is like, if you put a mirror in front of a bird or a creature, can they recognize that it's them in the mirror?
Whoa.
And magpies can do it. And they're in the raven family. So like, these birds are super, super smart. They can vocalize. Like, we've got examples of ravens like playing dead next to a beaver carcass to like falsely warn off other birds, like saying like, this meat is poisoned. Look, I died. When it's not. They're just lying, and they'll get up like once the other birds leave, and they'll eat. I'm telling you, like, these birds are super intelligent as in terms of like birds and animals really in general. So here's my theory. This is like, you can like poo-poo this, but I'm just wondering. You remember the serpent in Genesis 3, right? In the garden. Yeah. And you remember the punishment for the serpent. Do you remember? Like,
that he will be like the lowest creature of all.
Right. And like literally lowest, right? Like, you're going to crawl on your belly. You're going to like slither. So it seems like maybe there were legs originally, and then those are like taken away. And like, now you just slither on your belly from now on. And that is something that wasn't true about that creature, and then is made true for that specific reason in the garden, and continues to be true even today. Right.
Mm-hmm. I'm
wondering if these things that we know to be true about ravens maybe weren't true, and then were made true at Kerrit, by a God who wanted to like just give him some companions who would take good care of him, and who would, interact with him in a way that made him feel less alone. And then those qualities that Yahweh imbued the ravens with at that moment, then that just continues. And that's why ravens are so intelligent today. I don't know. Yeah. It's an interesting thought.
It is an interesting thought. Yeah.
That's the ravens. And 2, like, they are not, according to Leviticus, they're an unclean animal, which is an interesting twist to all of this. I don't know what that's about, but you've got this unclean animal, like, touching and bringing Elijah his food. I don't know.
But maybe unclean as in like can't eat it, not that you can't be around it.
Like unclean, like ceremonially unclean. Yeah, like you can't. That was the law. Like you can't eat it. But I don't know how that plays in. But I just wonder sometimes if
that is. I know
there's a lot more layers going on than I usually understand. So I'm wondering if that's one of them.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well,
so
how long do you think Elijah was in that state of depending on birds and in hiding? Do we know?
I have no idea. We're not told. It's just like after some time, the brook dries up. So it's a temporary situation. I think Yahweh knows that it's temporary. Of course he does. But it's got like, it's an expiration date, because the whole land is experiencing drought.
Yeah.
And so a brook that's like basically a tributary of the Jordan River is going to dry up eventually. Yeah. And lo and behold, it does. We don't know how much time passed, but I don't know, months, weeks.
Yeah. Well, the next clip, I think I wanted to include it just because it sets the scene so well for how dire the circumstance was with this drought and how awful it must have been. And just kind of your initial thoughts on like, why did God send me here? You know, this place, it's kind of a tumbleweed of a town. Let's get into it.
The road northwest to Zarephath is long. 4 days' journey, maybe 6. As Elijah travels, he has opportunity to survey the extent of the drought. As far as the eye can see, brown eclipses green. What was supple is now brittle. Wadis are dry. Fallen birds litter the ground, while hungry maggots make short work of their carcasses. He passes through villages full of gaunt children, the faces of their parents marked with anxiety. Lifeless soil is swept by the wind into swirling clouds that drift like specters past the beleaguered worshippers of Baal. The clouds offer bleak prognosis. Dust you are, and to dust you shall return. Finally, Elijah hears gulls crying. The air grows humid. He smells the sea. Amidst the failing vineyards and shriveling gardens of this once lush coastland, Zarephath waits. Why did Yahweh choose this place? And a widow who's bound to be struggling, how is she going to take care of him? But if Yahweh can use a raven. She's bent low when Elijah approaches and fails to notice him for a moment, perhaps. The prophet watches her. She's gathering sticks for a cooking fire, surely. It's certainly not hard to find good, dry firewood these days, but she's taking care, a strange amount of care, as she chooses each piece of wood, as though this is to be no ordinary fire. Please, Elijah calls to her. Her head snaps up. Please bring me a little water in a cup and let me drink.
Yeah, that was a bit more than I thought, but it's good to know that his state was, yikes, this place sucks. You know, like it was.
Well, like
so many words.
Everywhere did, essentially, at that point. Right?
And even on the coast, which is a bit of a taunt to see the ocean right there and yet be like shriveling in this town.
That's it. And to me, that, and I don't know if it's intentional, but it seems like maybe it is. To me, it's the perfect picture, what's happening with Israel, and it's all promise. And I think I say this in the episode, like the Mediterranean's right there. But, you know, that old rhyme, water everywhere and not a drop to drink, or that's not a rhyme, but, you know, that saying, like a sailor's sort of, you know, like
yeah.
in the ocean and like what you're just surrounded by water, but you can't drink any of it, right? Because it's salt water. And there is this saltwater sea right there, water everywhere, but just all promise and no provision, which is exactly what these false gods were. Right. They are the appearance, you know, everything that Israel could want. And if you rely on them, you will just shrivel and die because they cannot and will not give you anything.
It's, super symbolic. I was thinking more so like God is right there, but they can't access them because they've made decisions that have just like created a separation from him. But he's so close, he's just waiting. Layer.
Sure. But yeah, like this is a terrible thing. Like people are dying. It's not like you can just truck in water from somewhere else. Like in the ancient world, weather, you know, disasters are disastrous, and this is affecting everybody. And it's the judgment of Yahweh because of Israel's failure to say no to these false gods.
So I hate to get technical, but do you think this was just Israel? Do you think like at what, I don't mean to make it like a secular question, but how far was this famine? How
Yeah,
expansive was it?
I don't
Does it
know.
matter?
And in this case, I don't know that we know. And I don't think, I don't think it matters all that much. Yahweh tended to punish the people of Israel. I'm sure it wasn't like you reach this line of latitude and then you step over and it's like, oh, amazing. Like it's raining here, I'm sure it feathered out,
Yeah.
But it was the right amount of space that Yahweh like sort of enveloped whatever land he wanted to get a message across to. Essentially, it was everywhere Ahab thought he ruled. And it's a demonstration that, hey, you don't.
Got it. God directed Elijah to go find a widow that will receive him.
Yes, right.
And he walks up and sounds like she's the only person out and about. So he's like, gotta be her.
Exactly. Right. And it's interesting. Like it's clear that Yahweh has communicated with her ahead of time. Right.
Yep.
She knows like he's coming. And from various like clues, it seems like she's not an Israelite. So she's like maybe she's not a worshiper of Yahweh. And yet Yahweh has singled her out. He has spoken to her directly, and he has involved her in his narrative, which is just one more of so many examples in the Old Testament of the God of Israel being the God of the world and interacting with people outside of the bounds of the Israelite nation. I just wish sometimes that the nation of Israel would have read the Old Testament. They had access to so much of it, but it's like they just got lost as soon as they were thinking of themselves as the chosen people. They thought they were the only people with whom God concerned himself. And it just wasn't the case. Like again and again and again in the Old Testament, we see that Yahweh is seeing and loving and providing for and inviting the nations to come close to him.
Wow. I would have said that she was an Israelite and that is why God spoke to her. So that's really interesting. You say the opposite and that he was inclusive of her. And honestly, I like your version of that better. I thought maybe she was the only one that was hearing it because she was an Israelite. But was there like a hint there that I missed that indicated that she maybe wasn't?
I'm trying to look. I think later, like the way that she speaks seems like she's new to this. And I would have to look back. It's been a while since I wrote this episode, but I was somewhat confident that this was, in fact, not someone who was like a Hebrew. And I think it's not like black and white definite, but it's likely that she was not part of it. It's just the geography. She's so far up north.
Okay.
And so, and I think that may be just more of an indictment on Israel. The people who were supposed to have like a hotline to Yahweh had surrendered that. And, it's just like Jesus. He's like, hey, if you guys won't listen, I'll shake the dust off my feet and I'll go to the Gentiles. Paul says the same thing. Paul says, fine, I'll go to the Gentiles. And the rest of his ministry after he finally, gets fed up with how they're treating him in the synagogues is to the non-Jews. I think it's the same thing. It's if you won't listen, I have people who will.
Wow, that like speaks more to her character. I love the introduction of the woman, and I love this next part that we're about to get into because the fact that she wasn't an Israelite, if we're going to go with that, what she does is even more so amazing. And this is the part of the podcast that like hooked me, that like stayed with me for days. I told people about this podcast. I was like, this is how it's showing up in my life. Like what God asks of her and for her in her headspace. I think this is the next clip that we're going to listen to is be like, are you kidding me? Like, this is my last meal with my son. Like she was prepared to die. And yet she did something else.
Yes.
Let's get into it.
Why would the God of the Hebrews speak to her? The woman looks around at her home, the fields surrounding her house. The drought has not been kind to this place. The sea sloshes in the distance with cruel disappointment, all promise and no provision. She looks at her son. He smiles back at her with eyes that remind her of her late husband. How long has it been since she saw those eyes? How many suns have risen and set on a world crammed with his absence? How many more days can the two of them left survive? And now, this Yahweh appears in the heart of Baal's lands and leaves her a message, a strange command she is clearly unable to obey. Take care of some Israelite prophet, while every day she manages to feed herself and her child feels like a prize snatched from the jaws of this drought. She does not have enough. But she will not disobey the voice of deity, even when it is strange and foolish. She glances at her little son and back at the traveler, scoops the boy up in her arms perhaps, and goes inside to pour some water from their precious store. If these are to be their last moments on earth, so be it. She will spend them offering hospitality. In the house, she hears the man call, "Please, bring me a piece of bread as well." At this, the woman's eyes well with tears, surely. She looks at the jug of oil and the jar of flour, her last of each. She looks at her son, his cheekbones dangerously prominent. Her sandbagged defenses crumble, and her face is a flood of tears. She walks to the doorway, looks the man in the eyes, and says, "As Yahweh your God lives, I have no bread, only a handful of flour in the jar and a little oil in the jug." She tries to gather herself. "When you came, I was gathering some sticks in order to prepare it for myself and my son so that we can eat it and die." She wipes her eyes and sees the prophet looking back at her, smiling. "Do not fear," Elijah says to the woman. "Go, do as you have said, but make me a little bread cake from the flour and oil first, and bring it out to me. After that, you may make some for yourself and your son." The woman stands there stunned. Can he be serious? This is a wicked demand. How dare he? But his eyes are so kind. Before she can speak, Elijah continues, "For this is what Yahweh, God of Israel, says. The flour jar will not become empty, and the oil jug will not run dry until the day Yahweh sends rain on the face of the earth." What?
I love that clip so much. Like, even her, like, I feel like we live in that moment of having a lack for something and then God asking for a little bit more or to trust without having it. And we just like are stunned. You know, we haven't yet seen the miracle play out. And we look at God with this like shock, like, are you kidding me right now? Like, I am prepared to die. I'm at my wit's end. And she looks at Elijah and he just smiles. Like, that is, it's such a, yeah, I don't know. I feel like I live in that place of like, come on, God, like I'm waiting on the miracle. I'm waiting on the unending oil and the full flower pot. And God's like, okay, a little bit more. And you're just like, but all I've got is a cup. You know,
yeah, I really think like she thought she had played the ace. Like when he's like, "Hey, can I have?" And she's like, "Actually, this is like truly our last meal. We're going to eat this. This is all we have. And then we're going to die." And he's like, "Yeah, so cool. You can do that. But like, first, would you just make me something?" Surely she's just like taken aback by the gall.
100%.
But isn't that the way? Like you said, he is so often asking us, do you trust me? That's the question, right? And we can say that we do all day, but there's a much truer way of determining that. And that's often like what he's inviting us into is a place where we can't do it ourselves. And this makes no sense. I think that for me, that has been the goal of my life for a long time, is to live a life that makes no sense if God does not exist. Like if I find out that God is not real, I have just messed everything up. Like I've ruined my life. That and I, because I don't want to live a life. And I think a lot of Christians are living this life where, like, if it turns out God's not real, they're like, oh, all right.
Yeah,
My
I'm
Sunday's
good.
just opened up,
Yeah. Wow.
But if you're like truly depending on him, you're truly like giving your last meal to his prophet because he told you to, then you're I think that's the kind of trust that he wants. That's what he's after, because it's only in that place that he can really, like, that's the thing about open hands, isn't it? Right? Like, open hands aren't just something that he can take something from. There's something that he can put something into. And a closed fist is the opposite on both counts.
Yes.
And so, yeah. And by the way, this woman, verse 12, what she says to this prophet, she calls him Yahweh, your God. So number one, she kind of lives up outside the bounds of Israel. Number two, she calls Yahweh this prophet's God. He's not my God. He's your God. And so that's part of the clues that we get, that this woman is an outsider who already is demonstrating more faith than the insiders we were with a while back.
Yeah. Yeah. I love this part. And even the next clip, I honestly, like, on a side note, I have so many clips, but I know we're coming up on the hour. So I think it would be great just to kind of go over the miracle that happens. But I still want to talk a little bit on what you didn't cover in this episode and why, because I feel like you made something out of something people probably skip. They go straight to the fire raining down on the altar, and you chose the moments before that. So I think that's really, really cool. And I do want to get to that, but just for time's sake, maybe we just talk about kind of the miracle of this episode. Because I don't mean to skip out on the latter half of this, and a boy coming back from the dead, obviously another huge miracle, but I think we might be here for another hour, and I want to respect your time. So let's get into the miracle real quick.
Perfect.
The woman places the bread before Elijah, and Elijah smiles. Thank you. And then maybe Elijah nods to the jars on the counter. Another smile. This time, a wink. The woman rises nervously and approaches the jars she all but emptied a moment ago. She bends over them and peers in. His mother's shrieks startle the little boy, but Elijah's laughter calms him. More bread, lots of bread, probably. More laughter, and no less flour or oil. Just as Yahweh said.
I mean, not only would it be great to constantly open up your pantry and have like a Costco stocked pantry every time you open it up, but like amidst a famine, amidst like a miracle, and all for Elijah just to wink about it, like, I just feel like her reaction was a little underplayed, if I'm going to be honest. That is crazy. Like, what a God that, like, not even doubles, not even triples, but like an bottomless stock of food in the time that we need it most. Like, what kind of flour and oil do I need to trust God with that I need him to double by his terms and not mine?
It's a good question. And it's interesting too, the way that he does it. She does not look up at the counter and now there's like 40 jars of oil and 100 jars of flour. It's just the same jar. And it probably just like looks like, I picture it like half full, but it's just never going to run out. It's that daily bread again and again. It's just manna. I'm not giving you 2 days worth, except for on the Sabbath. But like, I'm not giving you a week's worth. But there's always going to be enough. You just trust me that every time you go back to this, I'll give you enough. But there's always, like, he's never like cutting the line of dependence between us and him. That is his MO. again and again. He wants you to come back to him again and again because
he's not going to give you excess.
That's what he wants. He wants the relationship. Like it's like, okay, God wants me to pray for my food and pray for whatever I need. Great. Like I will pray today for the next 4 years, dear Lord, until 2028. Please give me, I know I can be honest. Like I won't have enough food during this 4 years unless you give it to me. Please give me enough food. Please give me a good job. Please give us a good marriage. Like whatever you're praying for, you can pray, it's just not an option to pray it out years in advance and to do like bulk prayers and then to be like, peace out. I'll see you in 4 years, God, when it's time to make my next order. Because he doesn't just want you to have food. He wants you to know him and to love him. He wants to be with you. And it's just like, it would be the same as, the old joke about the husband. Like, his wife's mad because she's like, you never tell me I love you. He's like, I told you when I married you and I'll tell you if I ever change my mind. Right. Like once I say, I told you I love you, and that just applies now forever. That's like maybe true, but that's not a relationship. That's not intimacy. And that's what our God wants with us. And even in like giving her this surplus, he like created this tether of dependence. It's a both and.
Yes. And it is like taking up our cross every day. It's never an absolute. I feel like I used to read that parable about the seeds. Some seeds are choked up by the weeds. Some seeds fall into the stones. Some seeds take root in good soil. And I think as an early Christian, I used to read that of like, I'm definitely the bad seed, so I guess I'm screwed for the rest of my life. Like in my head, I applied it of like, well, that's who I am, so that's who I'll always be. But it like God is every day, come back to me. Every day you need your daily bread. Every day is a new start to take up your cross. No matter what happened yesterday, today is another day, because you're right. He's never going to be like, well, I gave you more than enough, so you're good for a week. Or, I think that is more like the devil coming into our life of like, you're good, the job's good, you don't need him for anything, you're content, you're satisfied, you're distracted. And God makes these moments of maybe some hardships so you become more dependent on him. Maybe not quite enough, so you still need him to depend on it. And you're right, it is for the sake of a relationship through trust.
Yeah. And so in the end, it's only good news. You being close to him is going to be so much better than you being set for life. He's going to give you both, but he's going to give you the one in a way that doesn't preclude the other.
My gosh, yes. That is good. Unfortunately, I don't think we have time for the rest of the episode, but absolutely go listen to it. I think we're not even halfway through with the clips that you sent. So the rest of this episode is amazing. I mean, do you want to give us the TLDR just so anybody listening?
Yeah. I mean, the crazy part, things keep happening in this story. Like he goes and, when he speaks to Ahab, it's like, okay, great. I did the thing you wanted me to do. Sorry, Ahab's really ticked off. You're going to have to go live as a fugitive. Okay, fine. Where? At this brook. Okay, I go to the brook, and then the brook dries up, and it's like, what? Seriously? Like, what now? Go to this widow. He goes to the widow's house, and he's like, I am so glad that, like, on the way, surely he's envisioning some rich old woman who's like gonna daddy warbucks him. Like, she's set. She's the only person.
She's set. She's
exactly.
Good.
And then he shows up, and this lady's getting sticks she's talking about, me and my son are about to die. Like, this is our last meal. And he's like, Yahweh, are you kidding me? Like, her? And lo and behold, it works out. But then her son gets sick. He's finally not alone. He's got this like little makeshift family. Then the son gets sick and the son dies. And again, it's like, are you kidding me right now? And so stuff just keeps happening. But then what happens when the son dies, when he falls ill and finally dies, is just an absolutely beautiful, really breathtaking moment in the narrative. And it was really a joy to try to do it justice in the episode. So there's the teaser. Go and listen to that episode. It's the one we've been listening to is season 5, episode 1, right? The Harbinger, call that one.
The Fugitive and the Host.
Yes, the Harbinger, the Fugitive, and the Host. And it's just beautiful. It just keeps on being hard, and it keeps on being beautiful, this story.
Yes. Yes, it is. And I guess I won't spoil it with what happens with the son, but it is a beautiful story. It is always good news. But this isn't the story of Elijah that most Christians know. Like, the story of Elijah that I remember is him meeting with the worshipers of Baal and them saying, listen, you believe in your God, I believe in mine. Let's have a bet. All right, let's see which God comes down with the rain of fire. You build an altar of dry sticks. I'm going to get some soaking logs and cover them in water. And you guys pray to your God. And they pray for hours, like 12 hours of prayer, of chanting, come on, Baal, come down, rain down your fire. And he's like, maybe he's asleep. Maybe he's busy. I don't know. He's mocking
He's truly
them.
talking trash. Yes.
And nothing happens. And he's like, you know what? He tells them to pour water all over his wooden altar 3 times. So at this point, there's a pool around the sticks that he's set up for Yahweh.
That's probably more water, by the way, than these guys have seen in one place in years, because we're still in the drought.
Whoa, I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, it's quite like, there's a lot of chutzpah in it.
They're like, that's our year's ration.
Yeah.
You know? Whoa, that added a different element. Yeah, and then he goes up, and I imagine it, and he's like, hey, God, it'd be a really great time if you showed up right now. Then he shows up.
He very
like,
much
I feel
does.
like he wasn't chanting or yelling. It was a soft, quiet prayer.
Yep, and Yahweh shows up in this enormous cloud of, or like column of fire, sort of reminiscent probably of what Moses and the Israelites saw during the Exodus. It's truly, you're right. Like, it is a standout scene, and it's very, I don't know if all cultures love that story, but it's very American. It's very like, shoot out at the
Very
OK
Hollywood.
Corral, very Hollywood ready. that story is. Like I love that story too. That's one that's stuck with me for a long time. And actually, that's one of the first stories I told in Holy Ghost Stories. That was one of the first 3 episodes I did.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. I'm listening to that tonight.
Okay.
That's awesome. I can't wait to hear you tell it. Do you go into Elijah going up on the mountain then? Is that a part of the story as well?
Uh-huh. Oh,
okay.
You mean like when he gets despondent and like after that? No. I haven't done that one yet.
Okay. I mean, that's such a special moment. Like, Elijah's story is phenomenal of all the things that happens. And to Elijah to go up on a mountain and experience God in the soft whisper, and then God say, what are you doing here? And to God always show up and always take care of him, and yet always still leaving Elijah in a state of needing.
Yep, exactly.
But also being provided for. It's this push and pull that really, I don't know, his story is phenomenal.
Yeah, you're right. This is the push and the pull. It's the both and. It's the tension. But hey, stringed instruments have taught us the tension is where the music is.
Oh, that's a line. What is the title of the other episode with the column of fire?
Goodness, Cassian,
I can look it up. I was just curious if you had it.
It is the Rainmaker and the Firebrand.
Okay.
Yeah, because this is like
cool.
That episode ends with the end of the drought.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Last question. Did Elijah really not die? A lot of the research that I did was like, he's the only prophet to live, him and Jesus are the only 2 to live forever. What the heck is that all about?
It's just another,
what happens?
I know, it's another one of those, like, what in the world? Elijah famously does not die. He has a protege named Elisha, right? Huh? And Elisha is like an understudy, and he is there actually when the whole thing happens. And Elijah is literally taken up to heaven in a flaming chariot and just doesn't die. And Elisha is watching him, like, screaming into the sky. My father, the what does he say? He calls Elijah the chariots of God, I think. Like, he'd seen him as this like war on the idolatrous practices of Israel. And anyway, it's a wild thing. And then, like, Elijah just climbs into the chariot and he's taken away. And that's the end of that.
Was this end of his life? Was this turned 35 and his bride showed up.
I don't know if we know exactly we might know around about how old he was. I mean, he'd lived a life, but it's not like he was, like he crawled up off his deathbed to like go get this limo out of there. He was very much alive, and then he just very much was taken. And this is the thing. Once before that happens, like Enoch back in Genesis does not die. We don't know what happens. It's just an Enoch. It's like in the middle of what do you call it? A genealogy kind of thing. And Enoch lived so many years and didn't die because God took him. And it's like, and this person lived, it's like, wait, rewind. What in the world? We don't get anything about that. Elijah is different because we do get a sense of what happened, but we have no idea if that's how it happened with Enoch. It, to our knowledge, at least it recorded in scripture, never happens again. This is the God we serve. He is always doing something new. He is always doing things different. Like he looks at his people. He's like, hey, I brought you out of Egypt by putting dry ground in. If I next time I do it, I'll put springs in the desert, I'll just completely reverse it. I do what I want. I make my own choices, and you cannot, I am predictably unpredictable. That's him. And Elijah,
predictably unpredictable.
Elijah experiences that. And man, yeah, straight up into heaven. I did that story as well. His what do I don't know what we call it.
Do you know the title?
No, of course I don't. I'll have to look. I'll tell you, I'll look and you can put it in the show notes.
Absolutely.
I've realized I've got now 55, 57, 58 episodes of this. And I've very intentionally named every episode the blank and the blank, or the blank, the blank and the blank, right? The mystery man, the firewalkers, and the new recruit. Well, the first is always Yahweh, right? The first is always my name that I give to Yahweh in that story. Who is he in this story? He's the mystery man, right? The mystery man, the firewalkers, and the new recruit is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, and Nebuchadnezzar is coming to faith, right? So the mystery man is that third person who appears in the fire, right? The firewalkers, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the new recruit is Nebuchadnezzar, newly come to faith at the end of this display. The guardian angel, the blowhard, and the reformer. Okay, now that's Hezekiah's story. Well, the guardian angel is, I'm referring to Yahweh because the angel of death comes and kills 185,000 Assyrians who are camped outside the city. Anyway, it's always Yahweh and then the people in the story. The problem with that is, the reason is I always like us to think about who do we see Yahweh to be in this story, because he's always the focus, he's always the star. And very intentionally, I'm not putting the names of the people in the story in the title, because ideally for people who are familiar with these stories, I would like them to come to them with fresh eyes, because it's so easy to be like, yeah, I know that story. Yeah, I know that story. I've got a box for that. But it's so powerful. We can just let ourselves be surprised and intrigued and let our hearts be broken or be delighted or whatever by the drama of these stories. And so I want you to experience them as as freshly as possible. However, that makes for a really difficult thing, even for me, going back with episodes. I'm like, man, which episode was that? What was it called? I just sometimes wish I'd done that was Elijah 1. That was Elijah 2. That was Hezekiah 1, 1.3. I don't know. But that's not what I've done. And so I've made my bed and I'll sleep in it.
Well, I like that. Okay, so in this case, then Jesus is the harbinger. And by that, do you mean the drought?
No. So the harbinger, a harbinger is one who comes with a message, and so Yahweh has a message for Ahab in the beginning. He has messages for Elijah. He has messages for this widow. And so I'm capturing sort of that communicative part of who God is, and that he is, I think a harbinger is often not just a communicator, but one who is signaling something big that's coming. And that's so often what Yahweh's up to.
Yeah. Good titling. I'm glad that you explained that because I've definitely been frustrated when I'm like, which ones are Elijah? And like, I couldn't tell. So I had to,
Yeah.
I just knew it because I picked a random one on that one time.
I am working on an index. So it'll be like a searchable index to where you can search by text or by character, even maybe chronology, and that'll make interacting with this library a lot more user-friendly. So
cool. Looking forward to it so we can find all of them now.
Yeah, and then maybe I'll be able to find the ones too.
Yeah, for your sake too. Well, this was awesome. Any shows coming up that people need to know about so they can attend?
Man, let's see. Live shows. We just did that one in Joplin with that high school camp. It was super fun. I've got a benefit dinner coming up in August, but that's a private show. I am doing, I haven't talked about this, but for your listeners, like this is kind of way ahead, but anybody who's in this area, so I'm in like Northwest Arkansas in the Ozarks, we're going to do a Christmas show in December in this area in a really, really stellar venue. It is like a little wood and glass chapel by a famous architect that's set right in the middle of this forest in the Ozarks. It's going to be really special. So
nice with live music.
Yeah.
I assume.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Live accompaniments. Awesome. It'll be a really special show. So that'll be a Christmas show. That'll be like December, but you can find out like I do a email newsletter every couple of weeks. It's called The Latest. People can sign up at holyghoststories.org. That's free. And I'm always like sending out one alongside the episodes that drop with a bunch of behind the scenes info about these episodes and the stories and things that I thought were interesting, maybe stuff that didn't make it into the edit. But then also in that email, I always talk about live shows and stuff that I've got coming up.
Cool. And when will tickets be released for this?
We'll probably do that in like maybe October 1st, end of September.
Okay, cool. And then they can just go to your website to get them.
Exactly.
Cool. I'll link all the links that you've sent me before in the show notes for anybody that's interested. Let me know when you're coming to Hawaii, and then I can get all my friends to come on.
We might need to set something
I'm out
up.
Here.
Yeah.
Isolated. We need the word of God out here.
We'll get something going.
No, this is great. I'll hold you to that, Justin. I cannot thank you enough for coming on the show. We might have to do a part 2 if we want to get the rest of the show in. If not, I'm going to keep listening to your episodes, especially with Elijah, and we can get another episode in the books. But until then, thank you so much.
My joy. Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to next time.
Of course. Have a great rest of your day.